Hello and welcome to the University of East Anglia Center for Japanese Studies Research webinar series. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Sherzad Muminov. I am the convener of the series, but also currently in this academic year, acting director of the CJS. And for today's seminar/webinar, because we also have some people attending in person in Norwich here, I have the great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Garren Mulloy, who I also like to call my friend and a great colleague. So, Professor Mulloy is a professor in the Faculty of International Relations and Graduate School of Asian Area Studies in Daito Bunka University in Saitama, Japan. He teaches intensive courses on peace operations for the University of Tsukuba Business School too. Garren's research has focused primarily upon Japanese security, having completed a PhD on Japan's self-defense forces overseas operations at Newcastle University in 2011. Garren has written extensively on international relations, contemporary defense, security, diplomacy, and other issues, and as well as historical studies of Japan, the UK, and questions of war memory. So his latest book, which he will present to us, it's a book talk, is titled Defenders of Japan, the Post-Imperial Armed Forces, 1946-2016, a history, which was published in 2021 by Hearst Publishers, Hearst & Co. The book combines historical and IR approaches and tells this in a comprehensive way, the very interesting, very intriguing history of Japan's armed forces in the post-war period. Professor Mulloy has also co-edited the book that is titled East Asia, Peacekeeping Operations and Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief, published in 2021 from Routledge, co-edited with Catherine Jones of St. Andrews University, and contributed chapters to many volumes. One of those volumes I also had a hand in. The volume is In the Ruins of Japanese Empire, Imperial Violence, State Destruction, and the Reordering of Modern East Asia. In preparation for that volume, I was a part of the project with Professor Brad Kushner in Cambridge, and that's when I first met Garren in 2016. It was a wonderful conference and a wonderful talk, which resulted in that chapter. So speaking of Cambridge and Professor Kushner, Garren is currently a visiting scholar in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, University of Cambridge, since April last year until the end of this month. And he's working on how the UK and other states engage with the Japanese Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, FOIP. And Garren has given two wonderful talks, probably more than two, but I've attended two, in Cambridge on FOIP, but also on his book. He's also continuing research into Japan's post-war period, memories of war, and development of defense institutions and policies, and researching a range of other issues, including a project with Catherine Jones and Vanessa Newby on oceans governance. So as you can tell from this introduction, from the range of activities that Garren is involved in, we have a great scholar who is a great specialist on so many different topics, and it is a great opportunity for us, both those of you who are joining online, but also some of our master's students and colleagues in this room, to learn about Professor Mulloy's research and ask questions to have an engaging discussion. So those of you who are online, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom, and please you don't have to wait until the end. You can, if you have questions, as the talk progresses, please feel free to put the questions in, and towards the end of the talk, we will have a Q&A session where you will be able to ask the question in your own voice, or we can read it out. So without further ado, let me give the floor to today's speaker, Professor Garren Mulloy.
Well, thank you very much. It always makes me look around the room when I'm referred to as an expert, because I always consider myself to be a student, because I'm never stopping trying to learn things, and there's always more to learn. And as you will see towards the end of the talk today, my book is a comprehensive history of the self-defense forces, and yet within a year and a half of its publication, I'm thinking, oh my God, it's outdated. It needs to be updated because things change. And that's why you should always consider yourself to be a scholar first. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's wonderful to be in this lovely place. And it's lovely to be in a room with real people. It's not just online. Nice for you to be joining online, but actually in a room with people is lovely too. So the talk is the same title as the book, Defenders of Japan, the Post-Imperial Armed Forces, 1946 to 2016. And many people do ask me, why 46 to 16? And I do actually talk about 1945, but I just very much wanted to show that I'm not talking very much about the end of the war. I am very much talking about what happened after the war. And why I don't begin in 1954 with the foundation of the self-defense forces is I also have one chapter which is very much about what happened between the end of the war and the founding of the self-defense forces. This is something I'm very keen on, which leads me to research questions. And I do apologize for PhD and master students who are sitting there thinking, hang on, my supervisor gets angry when I've got this many research questions. It's like, yes, this is a benefit of age and seniority. When you're a professor, you can ask as many research questions as you like. And here, one of the things that I'm very much aware of is that inside and outside of Japan, Japanese defense is often regarded as special, unique. And this is something that I'm rather uncomfortable with and yet recognized. It's something that, obviously, because I specialize in Japan, it's special to me. But also I'm interested in what happened in the period of 45 to 54, before the self-defense forces. I want to know who were the defenders of Japan before 54, and who are the JSDF now, and how or why are they different from other militaries? How did they develop in the ways that they did that people think of as unique? Why do they appear as they do, and what are their capabilities and limitations? What have they done so far? What could they do? How likely are they to prove capable of defending Japan up to what many consider to be a key date, which is 2049, which relates to the People's Republic of China, of course. Who are the other non-JSDF defenders of Japan? And how does this connect with the forward vision, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that Scherzo told you that I'm researching as well, and the new strategic statements that came out of Japan at the end of last year? And this links in also with something that happened just a few days ago in San Diego, where the UK, Australia, and the US came together with their AUKUS grouping, and that coincided with the UK announcing its refreshed Indo-Pacific integrated review. So these are all connected. I can't go into all of them in great detail, but I'll try to cover some of them. I should make a note about something about my chapter structure. Some people think that my chapter structure isn't very interesting, and I would agree. Basically, my chapter structure is very simple because my mind works in very simple ways. I like chronology. I didn't start off as a political scientist. I started off as a historian. And historians, yes, they can do thematic studies, but historians like me tend to do things in blocks of time, which are not necessarily the most interesting ways of dealing with subjects, but which I find easiest to do. So essentially, you've got the first chapter, which is the immediate post-war period. You've got the development of the SDF from 54. You've got a transition to post-Cold War, which includes, basically, it's the essence of my PhD thesis with the overseas dispatch, what we call peacekeeping, but also emerging threats close to home, which are particularly, of course, Russia, China, and North Korea, in no particular order. And then we have the defenders present and future, looking at Japanese defense today, the forces today, and also how Coast Guard and police fit in this. So when we go back to 45, we've got, of course, demobilization of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. But demobilization did not actually start immediately, and it did not mean total deactivation, because the Imperial Japanese Army were defending the Kurils against Soviet amphibious attacks after the surrender, after the 2nd of September. But certainly the period from the ceasefire, the 15th of August onwards, they were actively in combat. Japan's surrendered personnel was a term that was used rather than prisoners of war for Japanese troops after the 15th of August, particularly in Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, JSP were deployed, as these two photographs show, with British and Commonwealth forces in combat roles. This is something that not many Japanese know much about. And it reached a peak, particularly where these photographs are from, in what we now call Indonesia, around the city of Surabaya. And in Surabaya, Imperial Japanese Army and some Navy personnel were integrated in a British-led divisional battle group and fought a high-intensity combat operation against the Indonesian freedom fighters, the militia, which is called PETA. This was an extraordinary turnaround for such bitter enemies. To actually turn it around to become combat allies within weeks was astonishing. And also Imperial Japanese Army units continued fighting in China, many of them believing that they were under imperial orders from 1945, some of them until 1949, and then they evacuated to Formosa, which became Taiwan and the Republic of China. These tales are extraordinary. But when we actually look at those who continued fighting, rather than the organized units that I've already mentioned, then there are three categories we've got. We've got the holdouts, those who simply cannot stand the idea or accept the idea that Japan surrendered. We've got the idealists, those who believed in the ideals of the greater East Asia core prosperity sphere, that Asian people should rise up against the Western colonial masters. And the fugitives, those who probably would be tried for war crimes and essentially ran away. But those are not three clear groups. People had very mixed feelings, often, falling in love with a local person could be what motivated them. But the Imperial Japanese Navy, the personnel of the Navy, after demobilization, after the disbandment of the Navy, they continued minesweeping under the GHQ in Tokyo, the Allied control in Tokyo, SCAP. And these were waters around Japan, which were infested with mines dropped by the US Air Force, but also laid by the US Navy. So what this leads us to, the minesweeping, leads us to the Maritime Safety Agency, which began in 1946. And then this was Japan's only armed force other than regular police, which had limited access to arms. But the police forces themselves were massively reduced under GHQ control. With the outbreak of the Korean War, what we had was the foundation of the National Police Reserve from 1950 to 52. And this was primarily an internal security force. Now, many people have viewed it as the foundation of Japan's new army, but that's rather reflecting what we know later upon what was happening at the time. The Japanese government, Prime Minister Yoshida in particular, was urging the Allied occupiers to allow the Japanese government to increase their police forces because of strikes and things like this, which led to the US Army having to come in and put down demonstrations, which wasn't good for the US, and it certainly wasn't good for the Japanese government. So Tom French is the person I refer to as the key person here. He identifies very much the police nature of the founding of the force and how this then gradually changed to become more paramilitary until eventually it segues into the National Safety Force from 52. And this is very clearly a paramilitary force, which is on the way to becoming something like a military force, with the Coastal Safety Force as the continuation of the MSA as well. So that's fairly straightforward. This poster is actually for the air branch of the National Safety Force. As you can see, it looks like a military, smells like a military, it's like a military. What's the difference? Who knows? So where we get a big turning point, and Alessio Patalano has talked about this, written about this a great deal, it's Korea. The Korean War sees casualty figures largely hidden from the Japanese public. So, for example, 22 Japanese were killed as the crew of a US Army tug ship. Approximately 8,000 or more Japanese were deployed in Korea or around Korea, and it's estimated that at least 381 were killed in various ways. But the most important is the MSA minesweepers, which were civilian and only very lightly armed, were deployed to Korean waters by the US Navy, not by the Japanese government. The order from the Japanese government just confirmed what had already happened. One minesweeper was sunk and one of the crew members was lost. But this was something of a significant turning point for Japan, the realization of its maritime identity. But also ex-US Navy landing ship ferries, and there's a picture there, which is a little bit small to see. These were used as inter-island ferries, civilian inter-island ferries with Japanese civilian crews, but the US Navy just ordered them to be used for the Incheon landings on the west coast of Korea in combat. And in total, during the Korean War, 254 casualties occurred amongst the Japanese crews. 22 died in operations, 4 suicide, 208 self-inflicted wounds. People essentially shot themselves in the foot or the hand or hit them on the hand so they couldn't continue. This was not a happy time for them. So when we looked ahead to the establishment of the self-defense forces in 54, this doesn't just happen with defense. It also leads to the separation of defense and police, the clear separation. So the National Police Agency was founded at the same time, together with the Maritime Safety Agency. So these Coast Guard forces continued as civilians. And then the Defense Agency was founded with the Procurement Agency and the National Defense Academy, and the 3 self-defense forces were founded. The Imperial military only had 2 forces, but here we had 3. And the founding of the Air Self-Defense Forces covered in the book in quite some detail. The 3 key pressures that we had there were, first of all, the US Air Force, the influence of the US Air Force in pushing for an independent air arm, as it happened in America. Then you had the old boys of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army who were aviators, some of them very famous, quite influential. And the third one is most intriguing, which is Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru. And he lived in the UK for a long time, was a great Anglophile. His experience of air combat was 0, but what had most impressed him during the war was looking at how the Royal Air Force had fought the Battle of Britain. Now, very interestingly, his reference point was the RAF seeking to win the Battle of Britain, rather than the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy losing the air war over Japan in 44-45. That's very interesting to me. And it shows a great deal about how the legacies of war were very strong, but also quite limited in some ways. When we get Cold War development of the forces, the key things, of course, are, as written here, budget, recruiting, procurement, force planning. These are always important. And in the early days, Japan's economy was so weak that the budget for defense occupied a huge proportion of the national budget, well over 10% every year of the national budget. And in GDP terms, it was something like 5 or 6%. It was very, very high, particularly when we considered the 1% ceiling that we're so used to. Recruitment in the early days was not a problem. National Police Reserve had good recruitment, security force good. The Jietai, the self-defense forces, also had good recruitment at the beginning. But as it grew larger and larger, at the same time that Japan's economy, with this massive doubling of the economy during the 60s, then it began to become a problem. And particularly for the ground self-defense force, which grew to a nominal size of 180,000 troops, they never reached that total. The strange thing about recruiting is the peak of recruitment also coincided with almost the peak of the Japanese bubble economy in the late 80s. And it comes down to demographics. That was also the time where the baby boom of the 1960s led to this huge number of young people who were reaching the age of about 20 in the later 80s. Procurement was always a problem. A lot of it, the early equipment was American. Some of it was gifted with US military development aid, but obviously procurement has always been a problem. Force planning is one of the most interesting. And here it links in with US forces, Japan cooperation and coordination, which was very limited in the early days. And as we'll see, the Maritime Self-Defense Force was the one force that had very close integration with US forces, with the US 7th Fleet, which is based also in Yokosuka. They're pretty much next to each other. But you do also get this progression towards defensive independence, a point that wasn't really reached until most people would agree, the late 80s, some degree of defensive independence. But you also have a number of crisis points which emerge. And I can only briefly go through them. So 1960 was the revision and the signing of the Security Treaty, the AMPO. You get to 1970, where Nakasone, future Prime Minister, produced Japan's first defense white paper. And he had a very expansive view of defense that the country didn't necessarily share. But we've got other instances here. We've got the Mishima Yukio crisis. We've got 1976, which is the newspaper cutting on the top, which is the Belenko, Lieutenant Belenko, landed his MiG-25 at that time, brand new top secret fighter at Hakodate Airport, which sounds good. Japan was able to look at a MiG-25. Great, the Americans were so happy. Problem is, Belenko had been flying around over Hokkaido trying to be intercepted, flying slowly at 10,000 feet, basically saying, please come and guide me in. And the brand new Japanese air defense aircraft, the F-4 Phantom, couldn't find him. That was a huge embarrassment, but was also embarrassing not only for the government and the Air Self-Defense Force, it was embarrassing for the opposition in the Diet. And when you look at the Diet transcripts, it's fascinating the sort of spring-like swirls that tied up the opposition, because some of them are saying, well, you're clearly incompetent and you should give up government. But other people are saying it's clearly nonsense to try to defend our airspace. We should abolish the Air Self-Defense Forces. And others were saying, no, we should defend our air forces, but not use American planes. We should do something else. And none of these people seem to have a cogent idea about what they should be doing. And of course, we come up to incidences such as the invasion of Afghanistan, which had a major effect upon Japan. But also in 1983, we have the shooting down of the Korean airliner, which led to wreckage and, unfortunately, human remains washing up on the coast of Hokkaido. So we get to the late 80s, and this could be seen as Nakasone's dream, which is large, well-resourced, very capable Japanese defense forces by the end of the 1980s. Nakasone pushing money into it. He actually went over the 1% limit of GDP spent on defense. Genuine defense capability, genuine admiration for the forces, certainly in Washington. But then there's the bit of a nightmare. And the bit of a nightmare is Japan essentially throughout the Cold War, and as the Cold War went on, it diverged even more. There were three forces with three completely separate plans of defending Japan, with very little reference between the plans. And this is most notable when you're looking at the ground and then the maritime forces. Maritime forces were looking at minesweeping around Japan. Japan would not be blockaded by mines. Okay, then they were looking at sea lane protection to protect the maritime trade that Japan depended upon. Again, a legacy of the Second World War. Thirdly, linking in with US Navy and broader US Cold War Northeast Asian strategy to keep the Soviet submarine fleet penned in to the Sea of Okhotsk, not allow them outside the first island chain, and to keep everything contained, which is great. Only one thing missing: defending the coastline of Japan, which is what the Ground Self-Defense Force were trying to do. The Ground Self-Defense Force thought, well, the Soviets might attack from Hokkaido. Very short straits, huge forces in the Northern Territories and Sakhalin and these other places. This is a major threat, so that's what they focused on. That's why Hokkaido had the best and the most military forces for the JSDF. But they had very little reference to the maritime forces. very little interaction between the two. Really minimal interaction and almost no planning, to the point that by the late 80s, funded by the Nakasone budget and earlier budgets, the Ground Self-Defense Force developed an anti-shipping missile capability, one of the leading capabilities in the world, because they had no faith in the Maritime Self-Defense Force to undertake such roles. Maritime Self-Defense Force invested in the Aegis technology because they didn't have a lot of respect for the Air Self-Defense Force capability to defend the Japanese fleet. Aegis, one of the most expensive and manpower absorbing systems you can have. And the Air Self-Defense Force is very, very interesting, talking with Air Self-Defense Force personnel at the time. They said, we wanted to fly at 30,000 feet. Air defense, that's what they wanted to do. That's what they thought was their role. However, they were forced to do support for the maritime and support for the ground forces. They didn't really want to do that. They were kind of pushed into it, including for procurement. Very, very interesting that these three plans went in different directions. And essentially the reason for this was a failure of civilian control. Civilian control is this, this huge issue in Japan post-war. And the whole point about that is the civilian control, was about controlling the military so it didn't rise up as it did during the 30s and 40s. But the other side of civilian control is actual coordination between the three forces. And on a bureaucratic or political level, this was completely inadequate. So we're looking at post-Cold War developments, and you have continued budget inflation. There's no peace dividend. There is absolutely no peace dividend in Japan until you get into the 2000s, and then it's almost, marginal. You have major procurement continuing, as in with the Aegis system. You've got no immediate adjustment to the post-USSR. The Gulf War crisis, Japan must act. But Japan was tied up in socio-political knots about dispatching forces overseas. So eventually they had the first dispatch, which was of minesweepers, again, like Korea, but MSDF minesweepers sent to the Persian Gulf in the spring of 1991, after the war's finished. And they did a decent job. But this was the absolute minimum that was considered acceptable to the US allies, but the absolute maximum the Japanese felt capable of doing. So because of all of this pressure, the concept that we cannot go on like this, various Japanese governments tried to pass what they call the peacekeeping bill. They failed, and then eventually an overseas dispatch bill was passed, and that led to the first overseas dispatch of ground forces to the UNTAC UN peacekeeping mission in Cambodia in '92. So the JSDF were jeered, and the opposition parties tried to block the dispatch because they thought this would be like the army going into China in the 1930s. This is how little was understood about the changed nature of the forces compared to the military. And of course, when that first group came back to Japan, the same people who jeered them often cheered them and clapped and welcomed them home at the airport and thanked them for being Japan's peace servants, the representatives of a truly liberal, democratic, peaceful Japan. But there were also domestic threats to human security, such as natural disasters. Japan has no shortage of those. But strangely, terrorists with the Aum Shinrikyo gas attack in the subway. And of course, a major issue that emerged in the post-war period is demography. An increasingly elderly population with what became a shrinking population, and an absolutely shockingly shrinking number of young people, including people to serve in the forces. But also the rise of regional threats to national security, primarily North Korea, China, and to a lesser degree, Russia. So when we are actually looking at Japan and places in society, culture, policy, law, the self-defense forces have a modulating social position. We can see a lot of people rejected the forces because they believed in Article 9. Pacifism, we shouldn't have a military. That makes logical sense. But then there are other people who believe in Article 9, but actually, it's good to have the self-defense forces, disaster relief, human security, but also maybe defending us against other countries. The sense that national culture and force culture was somehow different, but linked. And with force culture, there's this very interesting the 5 principles of force culture, which if you read them, they're listed in the book. If you read them, it reads like some sort of very liberal arts, humanities-based education program. It doesn't seem like the training program for armed forces at all. And then you get the policy irresponsibility or responsibility. Again, this issue of civilian control. It's about keeping the military down, but not actually engaging with what the military are doing. The lack of understanding for defense issues, security issues, and the forces is quite remarkable in Japan. And therefore, the SDF law, the constitution, these things are regarded as fixed, whereas actually they're fluid, because the interpretation of each of them has changed, and certainly the laws have changed over the years, most dramatically, of course, in 2015, where there were major demonstrations against the new security laws put forward by Mr. Abe. So just to refresh us, the underlying part is particularly important. Land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. And I'm sure there are 1 or 2 of you who can see a slight contradiction there. For those of us who are old Japan hands, we know that the use of the word forces here is a translation. The original Japanese says gun, military. So this is how the interpretation allows the forces, but doesn't actually allow a military. This is how military forces are considered to be different. But very interesting is the next part, next sentence. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Again, interpretation of that has changed. Defensive action is allowed to defend Japan. Belligerency is seen as attacking others. But as we will see, Japan is steadily acquiring the capability to, in a way defensively, gain an offensive capability, an attack capability. So the present duties, some of the present duties, we can't look at them all. But there's support to the civil power. As we know, disaster relief is number 1. There is a law and order duty, which has never been used, but also there is contingencies. But the disaster relief aspect of SDF work is the one that catches the eye and that the public very much appreciate, not least in 2011 with the tsunami and earthquake, where the JSDF became integrated into the local societies in Tohoku to a degree not seen certainly since the Second World War. Incredibly highly respected. Their efforts were amazing, with 1 or 2 caveats that we will talk about later. National defense is clearly also a priority, which you would think in the post-Cold War period would be a non-issue. But Japan does have 3 territorial disputes, and one of them appears to have the capacity to lead to friction, possibly even conflict, which is the Senkaku issue in the East China Sea. But increasingly, regional and national defense are being blurred, because if you're looking at the East China Sea and the Senkaku, what is the closest landmass of any size to the Senkaku Islands? It's Taiwan. And Taiwan is always an issue, but in the last couple of years, it has become a much stronger issue than it was previously, which leads us to consider the global alliance that the regional and local, which could become a global alliance with the US and Japan's increasing partnerships, and not just partnerships within what we now call the Indo-Pacific region, but global partners, including the UK. If you had to look at which is the closest, most integrated, the deepest partnership Japan has, definitely it's Australia. And Australia should be the model of other countries who wish to engage with Japan. There's lots of aspects on defense, yes, but there's a lot more than just defense. Partnerships are very vague and difficult to define, but the partnerships that Japan is cultivating, some of them have no defense aspect at all. Like with the EU, there's very little defense element in the EU partnerships, either the strategic partnership or the economic partnership agreement. And this leads us to considering Japan's global security roles. The pictures here show essentially the Quad. It's a slightly outdated photograph of Prime Minister Kishida with the Quad leaders. The Australian leader, of course, has changed. But also the bottom picture shows how on the 4th of October last year, a North Korean ballistic missile was fired over Japan. And this leads us to consider the difficulty that Japan has with the issue of North Korean missile defense. The flight time of this missile was 20-something minutes. And in that time, it covered 6,200 kilometers, I think. So the window of opportunity to intercept for Japan is very limited. And if Japan did choose to shoot down a missile, is that belligerency? If the missile is not targeted at Japan, it's not defense of Japan. So is it belligerency to shoot down a missile? If you try and fail, what's the effect? If you try and succeed, what's the effect? If you don't try and the missile hits US territory, what's the effect? These are all issues that I believe Japanese government hasn't fully thought through the implications of. So I just wanted to show, for those of you who aren't so familiar, the three territorial disputes. So there's one with Russia, the Northern Territories on top right. And then there's the one on the left, which is the Takeshima or Dokdo, the Korean-held island, which is very small and really insignificant. And I do wish that Japan and Korea could just get over this, but this is one of Japan's great blind spots. But then we have the bottom right map, which is the East China Sea and the positioning of the Senkaku or Diaoyu islands in there. And essentially what we're looking at is a challenge not only to Japan's territory, the claim on the territory, but it's the demarcation between China and Japan in the East China Sea. It's a broader issue. There's also a very strong link with Taiwan. There's also a very strong link between the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And South China Sea, of course, is vital for not only Japanese, but many countries' maritime trade. And Japan is predominantly a maritime trading power. So when we're looking at Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, this is like the maritime hinge of Japan's strategic position. And the partnerships that Japan is trying to have, some of them are seen as linking in with US laterals, the many laterals. Japan is a sort of reinforcer of the US alliance and security. Korea is constantly the blind spot of Japan, limited local interaction. But now, today, of course, President Yoon is visiting Japan and relations seem to be improving. And he is a particular fan of Japanese omuraisu, I hear. So maybe this will be like omuraisu gaiko, you know, like omelet rice diplomacy. Possibly, who knows? The thing with Korean politics is that it is so partisan, it swings between engagement and disengagement. Japan really needs to find a way through for this. When it comes to Southeast Asia, Japan has made great efforts to engage with ASEAN states in a buttressing role, but also as an independent role. So the SDF have done like peace operation training, search and rescue training, SAR, and especially humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations within the area and training with area forces, both civilian and military. So CIV, CIVMIL, and MILMIL, civilian and military. And Japan really should be projecting itself as an HADR superpower. It has enormous capabilities, great experience, civilian and military, civilian and self-defense force. For the Philippines, it's a bit of an odd one. Tokyo is the happy place for the Manila government. It often finds engagement with Washington difficult, even when they are quite friendly, but it is tricky for them. And they're very, very happy, find it very easy to engage with Tokyo. And wartime legacy issues are just never on the table. I will very briefly go through, because I know we're going to be short of time, so I'll briefly go through with Taiwan. Taiwan is a major issue here because of regional and other shocks. This is related to the rise of China, its ambitions, its arms, its riches, decline of Japan. And I do, when I say the rise of China, please do not think that I consider China to be always like the Bond villain character. It is not. China's got legitimate interests, legitimate concerns, and we can identify other countries that do behave in a similar way to China. But simply the scale of China and its dominance now of the South China Sea area leads to great fears. And one of the fears that Japan has had for a long time is the twin fears of US abandonment, that somehow the US will leave Northeast Asia or abandon Japan to some degree, but also the fear of entrapment, that, you know, by provoking some form of conflict, whether it's a trade conflict or a harsher kinetic conflict, that somehow Japan will be dragged into a war. So Japan desires partners and partnerships for reassurance, but also fears any risk or obligation that may come with such partnerships. So it is buttressing and building norms, using international law as a kind of weapon with which to beat Russia, but particularly China, but often North Korea too. There are various Taiwan-Korea scenarios. Japan traditionally seen as what we call the quiet water carrier in a background logistical supporting role. But increasingly, China is regarding Japan as a likely combat adversary if conflict breaks out around Taiwan. So Japan is a great power as a warring state, highly unlikely, but what could be the catalyst to provoke Japan to consider being a belligerent, a fighting warring state? It would have to be something very, very extreme. And I'm not sure that the invasion of Taiwan would be it. The Ukraine, this has provoked a major change in policy towards Russia from the Abe period. Abe did everything he possibly could to ameliorate with President Putin, but that was not sustainable. Certainly with the invasion of Crimea, it wasn't sustainable, but it was sustained. But the invasion of Ukraine, certainly not. So when we're looking at future roles of the forces, we're looking at cyberspace and information as areas, traditionally civilian areas, which are becoming increasingly part of the defense realm. So we've got multi-domain rapid deployment. So the Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade, the ARDB, is something that we can look at. Joint operations are essential for the operation of amphibious forces. And it is in joint operations where the self-defense forces have continuing major problems, but are seeming to take some steps towards fixing them, but certainly not enough yet. The forces, like other militaries, will have to become first responders also in the climate change effect. They're going to have to be managing some of those effects. And also the effects of depopulation, because countryside communities cannot deal with issues like snow clearance. Sometimes it may be firefighting or medical service provision, because they do not have enough people in civilian roles. So the forces, which will also struggle to recruit, will have to fill the gap. And when we're looking at future roles, obviously the reinforcing the Nansei shot of the Southwestern Islands is a major defense priority. But when we're looking at future roles, peace operations look as though they're off the table. Japan is not joining any peace operations now. HADR operations, yes, Japan will do those, I'm sure, but isn't doing any of those at the moment. Essentially, it's doing counter-piracy work off Djibouti. National defense and regional defense are increasingly being combined, but increasingly also both China and Japan are going back to old Cold War ideas, which you can see on the map, the red line, which is the first island chain, and the blue line, which is the second island chain, which China considers to be the US position to contain China, and which the US and Japan consider to be symbolic lines, shall we say. But these issues are all pertinent, but the ones that are underlined are those of particular defensive concern to Japan. And when we do look at that, we look at the Nansei shot, or the distances that have to be covered in the Southwestern Islands. This is a very tricky thing to do for law enforcement, but also for defense and security. There are carbon and fisheries issues, the territorial demarcation issues, and the proximity of Taiwan to these islands, such as the Senkaku and Yonagunijima, which is Yonagunijima. That one there, for those of you who are not so familiar with the kanji, the bottom left, much closer to Taiwan than to the Okinawan main islands. This is a very tricky safety and security management issue, both for the Japan Coast Guard, which is very large and capable, and for the self-defense force, and hence the continuing reliance upon US alliance. But there are also outstanding issues of force culture, force sustainability, economic sustainability, also on a political level with risk acceptance and the roles of partners. The forces need to work more upon their joint and combined consciousness and investment. The perception of tempo tempo, the speed by which things are changed, done, regenerated in training and policy making. Japan has been very, very lacking in this sense of tempo. And there are also evidently, obviously, legal legacies upon society, culture, and force doctrine. And this is just one of those examples of the unsustainability of the JSDF, which I'm afraid to say. The A is the defense budget, GDP. Now, again, this is out of date because the Japanese government has announced over the next 5 years, they will double Japan's defense budget to be roughly double. Roughly 2% of GDP, whereas at the moment it's like 0.95 or by NATO standards 1.24. So maybe just under doubling it. Coast Guard budget also will be increased. But here we've got a comparison with, on the far left, US, then UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. So as you can see, Japan will still be below the level of UK, let alone the US. But still, 2% of Japan's GDP is a significant amount of money. The other graph, though, shows the difficulties of spending money without the people to spend it on. Because this is age rank distribution. So the blue color that we have towards the bottom are the enlisted personnel, the private soldiers or the seamen, airmen. And the gray color we have are the non-commissioned officers, the corporals, the sergeants, the warrant officers. And then the dark gray is the officers. So between 2017 and 1990, the officer figures don't change that much by rank and by age. The NCOs, we see some difference. The major difference, of course, is the younger ranks of the enlisted personnel. Large numbers of them in 1990. By 2017, far less. And today, less again. So what we're looking at is an unsustainable structure, but Japan is not adapting to that demographic challenge to its defense and security. And I will talk a little bit about Japan's fourth vision that I mentioned earlier. This was not something that suddenly occurred. This is something that gradually emerged from Prime Minister Koizumi in 2002 through Mr. Abe, Mr. Aso and others. And the national security of 2013 alluded to something like this, but it was a declaration of FOB strategy in 2016 that became a vision in 2019. But we also had defense policy guidelines. The key thing is the 2022 national security strategy and national defense strategy that came out. The FOIP is regarded as in line with Article 9 of the Constitution, but also as being an open platform for liberal democratic states to engage with. And this just goes to show how FOIP and national security strategy seem to be out of kilter until 2022, when all of this seemed to be closely coordinated and come together. I only show these four covers of the the defense of Japan, the defense white papers, just to show some researchers actually analyze these and say, oh, the pink color, it shows that Japan is trying to use soft power for kawaii, cute defense. And the samurai, oh, it's the Bushido spirit, that Japan is going to rise again. No, it's just a cover. I don't know who decided this. I keep asking people, they don't know. But the last one for 2022, clearly the intern had control of the Photoshop software and went a bit crazy. That's all it is. But I do enjoy these things. But when we look at the 2022 national security strategy, the big innovations are the clear or increased identification of China and Russia as security threats and the salience of the Taiwan issue for Japanese defense. We've got increased emphasis on international cooperation and collaboration, and we've got the continuation of the US alliance as the cornerstone for everything that Japan does. Then the defense strategy, we've got the budget items, which are very big, but unfortunately very little detail on how they're going to be funded. Inadequate explanations of funding, inadequate explanations of many things. There's no increase of regular or reserve personnel or about sustainability of these human resources. There is a greater functionalization of the US alliance, but no combined command. There's eventual prioritization of deterrence and defense, but there's no sense of a regional command for the Southwest, a joint regional command. It doesn't exist. So how are these forces going to be controlled? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Some defense logistical issues, quite particularly detailed issues were looked at, such as blood supply, oxygen transport, etc. But very little engagement with civil society, which was a major blind spot for the LVP. And then we've got Japan Coast Guard. These issues of security and safety are combined for the Coast Guard, which is civilian. They do counter-piracy work. And Japan has a very strong maritime identity and a maritime safety and security need. And the China Coast Guard is the main challenge to the East China Sea management, which the Japan Coast Guard is trying to contain and deal with in a legal and safety and security aspects. So that the Japan Coast Guard is incredibly important in all of this, despite not being a military force. And the East China Sea is an area where conflict could occur. So when we're looking at conclusions here, the conclusions we've got, we can see both dramatic and very gradual changes in the forces in Japanese society, culture, and policy regarding Japanese defense. We can see an expansion of their roles from internal to external roles involving human and international security. We see a limited acceptance of risk within Japanese security policy, but also strategic expansion, particularly looking at the East China Sea and the role of Taiwan in Japanese defense and security. Japan is widely respected as a reliable HADR and in some ways peace operations partner, but the withdrawal from South Sudan in 2016 really damaged confidence in Japan as a peacekeeper. And also there are questions about Japan as a security partner. How reliable or dependable will Japan be? There's limited capability to sustain operations, but the National Defense Strategy has tried to fix some of those problems, but it still isn't sustainable for any great period. Continuing issues with both combined and joint aspects with US partners and Japanese civilian partners. There is existential force management and sustainability issues, strategy, economy, and particularly demography. But Japan and the self-defense forces will be the field managers of massive social and climatic problems. There are multiple civilian defenders of Japan, Coast Guard, police, both in cyber and space, policy, and especially we saw with the tsunami, local government and citizens are defenders of human security. Very important to recognize that. The FOIP buttresses what's happened with the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy, but it is also a very vague platform for people to engage with. The vagueness gives it a flexibility and adaptability, but also a problem with credibility. And that's where the issue lies. So there's my book. Oh, one thing I did forget to say, actually, I do apologize. Here, Okinawa Police in the middle, the Border Island Security Force. This was established 2 years ago. And what it means is the police force in Okinawa to defend these distant islands, they set up a small unit, about 160 people, with helicopters, weapons, body armor, things like that. So what you have is a police force becoming a paramilitary police force, which is essentially where the self-defense forces, the precursors of self-defense forces started back in 1950. So in one way, it's kind of come full circle, this interaction of internal and external security. So all I'll say is thank you very much for joining, and please, happy to ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Garren. Wonderful talk, a lot of information, very informative. So before I check the Q&A window, maybe I should ask the audience for any questions. So please don't be shy. Please ask any questions that you might have. I might actually kick it off. Okay. So yeah, using my position. So you mentioned you showed the map of the trajectory of a North Korean missile, yeah, which is usually becomes big news in Japan every time it happens. It has happened over the past 10 years quite frequently. Yeah. So, and then you mentioned all these difficult decisions, or the difficult decision that the Japanese SDF would have to make. Yeah. Do you shoot them down because they are flying over Japan? If you shoot them down, will that be defense of Japan? If you don't shoot them down and they hit American targets, will it? So all of those dilemmas, how are they discussed, or what are the arrangements, or what is the understanding between the Japanese and the Americans?
Right.
Do the Americans expect the Japanese to do anything? Do the Japanese want to do anything but can't? Do the Japanese don't want to do anything because there's the Americans and they rely on Americans? I mean, I'm quite ignorant on this, but I'm really curious about that. It's a big issue and a big, it causes a lot of anxiety in Japan. So I think that's the question.
Okay, it's a very good question. What I would say is the measures that have been taken are very interesting. Essentially, the Air Self-Defense Force moved its headquarters to be next to the US Air Force headquarters in Japan. Not the Americans moving in with the Japanese moving in with the Americans at Yokota, US Air Base in the outskirts of Tokyo. That's the first thing. And the primary reason for doing that was for missile defense. That was it. It was so they could coordinate everything. And one of the key things that I didn't really mention because of time was that intelligence access is always an issue with the Japanese. So they're not a member of Five Eyes. They do not get the same level of highly classified intelligence access that the US obviously has, but other Five Eyes partners have. And that's because Japan is seen as being in some ways a slightly unreliable intelligence actor and holder of classified information. So if the two forces are integrated like this, and if real-time intelligence comes in regarding missiles being fired, the Americans can instantly share with the Japanese regarding this very specific point. It doesn't need the broader national to national engagement for intelligence. So as far as the forces and the US military getting their act together, that's actually quite good. If we also look at the forces' ability to shoot down missiles, they've got two main things to do. One is the Aegis system on ships. There are 8 Aegis ships at the moment, but building more. And they are capable of shooting down missiles. But the point is, shooting down a missile using Aegis is not easy. And usually there will be 1 or 2 Aegis vessels on station at any one time. So again, it's tricky. The window of opportunity is going to be a few minutes. So it's not easy to do. The Air Self-Defense Force have got these Patriot missiles, but that is literally a last-ditch attempt to knock out a missile that's literally heading on to Tokyo or somewhere. And one of those batteries is actually based quite close to my home. So the ability to shoot down is quite limited, but the most limiting factor appears to be the political side. And the political side is the desire to be able to do this. Clearly, Japan was going to invest in Aegis Ashore, a more comprehensive system, but that didn't address the political aspect of giving the order and whether the politicians could be consulted within time to give the order. And you need to have a political part in this process because an act of potential belligerency is such a major step for the Japanese government to take, to allow. They would not hand over that to the Air Self-Defense Force alone or the Maritime Self-Defense Force. So, and then the other aspect of it is there is no discussion in the public domain about the political and diplomatic implications of this. It just is not discussed. And of course, as we know, politicians in Japan try to exercise a degree of restraint or control over media, such as through the Kisha Club, you know, the press club that you have in each ministry and in the Kante. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think Liam here has a question. Can you please introduce yourself also?
Yeah, I'm Liam on the interdisciplinary Japanese Studies course here at UEA on the Masters. And my question is maybe a bit basic or general, but what is the concern based? So you mentioned that Japan fears America may leave Asia and effectively leave Japan on its own. Is this based on any specific event, or is it just like a concern which is always there, or also something at the more bit of that individual?
Liam, that's not a basic question. That's a fundamentally excellent question. Good question. It is based upon something general, ambient in the background and something specific, or some things specific. If you go back to the late 1970s, President Jimmy Carter made an announcement regarding the neutron bomb. And the neutron bomb was the idea of like a nuclear weapon that would produce lots of radiation, but not destroy much infrastructure. And this was seen by the US at the time as a great potential saving for deploying military forces, a budget item. But when you are the government of Germany or Japan or Korea, it looks like the worst thing anyone could possibly suggest. So that's why it didn't gain much traction. The desire for the US to cut defense spending after the Vietnam War was very strong. And there was actually an effort to, a proposal to withdraw the 7th Fleet from Japan from the early 70s. And strangely enough, that's when the US decided to do something different, which was to forward deploy an aircraft carrier in Japan on a permanent basis. The only forward deployed aircraft carrier in the Pacific region. But when you actually come to something more recent, such as the time when President Trump was in office, President Trump came in with a very specific pledge to force Korea and Japan to give more money to the United States. Otherwise, the US would consider running down their forces in each country. So these are the specific things, but the background is always that the United States is the hegemon. It's the world hegemon, and it's certainly still the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific hegemon, the greatest power. But with increasing challenge from China, there is always the rising question of what America is willing to sacrifice for other countries' securities and its own in the region. So if the risk, for example, of defending Taiwan is that, US aircraft carriers could be sunk, would America be willing to take that risk? And the answer may well be not. And if that's the case, if they're not willing to defend Taiwan in case of invasion, then what about the Senkaku Islands? What about Okinawa? What about everything else? So that's the sense of abandonment and sense of entrapment. Again, you look at the war on terror, you look at the war in Afghanistan, you look at the invasion of Iraq. All of these were the US choosing to go to war and actually really putting pressure on Japan to join in. And this has escalated over the years. At the moment, the US is not involved in any such war. But the Japanese know that it could be down the road and probably will be. So expectations always, the more Japan does, the more US expectations rise above that level. Japan is usually playing catch up. At the moment, it's a period of stasis. But if the conflict with the trading conflict with China, if it were to become more kinetic, more physical, then the expectation in Japan is that more demands will be made of Japan by the US, hence entrapment. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Lily.
Okay, so maybe if I just have a look at the online. So Q&A, it looks like we have a question from Professor Watanabe. So the question, well, first, let me ask if Professor Watanabe would like to ask the question would you like to ask in your own voice?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, the question is that about the role of kidotai of the police, because in the 60s, I was a student in Japan, and the normal perception of police by the Japanese is a sort of equivalent of British local friendly Bobby, whereas the kidotai, though they were police, were completely regarded as something different. They look different, and they and they were also really huge. And for us, it looked like a military force for internal purposes, rather than just simply another sort of just a little bit more police. So the difference of perception was very, very different, and more or less the entire student population was extremely hostile to Kidotai, whereas not so to the general police.
So shall I make a comment to that?
Oui,
Okay.
yeah. Well, Watanabe-sensei, thank you. I totally understand your feeling, and particularly when you're looking at what happened in the late 60s and early 70s with student demonstrations on the Kidotai. This is a very understandable view. And I actually watched the Kidotai do some training, which was like a demonstration riot training. Fearsome, absolutely fearsome. Japanese police are wonderful. When you go to like the police box, the Koban, and you ask for directions, they're always so friendly. And then you see these guys, it's like, oh my God, where did they come from? It really is very different.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that although they appear to be military, if you actually visit other countries such as Germany, France, whatever, Japanese police, Korea is a very good example. I was in Seoul in '94, and I actually was stood right next to a demonstration where the police went in and attacked the students. I'm actually, today's police, Kidotai, is much more of a multi-purpose force, which has an anti-terrorism role. It's also got like an organized crime containment role. It is like the police reserve, the Keisatsu Yobitai back to 1950.
Yes, that was my sort of association. Keisatsu Yobitai, Kidotai, so similar.
Yeah, it is very similar. But the difference, I think what I would say the difference is that all of the police officers who join the Kidotai first are police officers. They do the regular police training, and then they specialize with Kidotai. So the force culture is very much that of the police force, but it is the paramilitary looking element of the police force. And this goes back to 1954, when the self-defense forces were formed, the National Police Agency was formed, and they realized they needed this law enforcement element. However unhappy the association was for people who lived through the demonstrations of the 60s and the 70s, in particular, like near Narita Airport in the 70s, it's very similar. The association of police in Japan is not usually regarded in such a negative term. But I think there's one thing that's worth adding, which is that the self-defense forces retain a duty in law to support the civilian power in times of such as major riots, demonstrations, or uprisings. They have never carried out such a role, and they very rarely train in such a role because it is so sensitive. But also what I would suggest is that, having done research on police as well as on military, I would suggest that Japanese police today and the Kidotai sense of training and responsibility is very different from the 60s. I think it has moved on, and they are rather more conscious of their role as public servants. That's my perception. I may be wrong, but I'm hoping that's the case.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk, really. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed being able to talk with you. I only wish we had more time to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if you had a question about the self-defense forces or Japanese forces, armed forces in general, didn't know who to ask, this is your time. So any other questions from the audience? No?
But can I also add, if there is a question about something I didn't talk about, something that simply I didn't mention, I'm also happy to talk about it, because I'm just happy to talk about anything, basically.
Okay. Yes, Sheila, please.
Hi, I'm Sheila. I'm the Post-Imperial, a CJS. So I guess you just didn't mention in the presentation because of the time, but I'm just wondering what's the public perception of self-defense force in Japan today, especially after the whole Ukrainian issues going on.
Okay, it's a great question. To give you a little bit of context, the SDF were not greatly regarded during the Cold War from their founding. But one of the key things about the SDF was that people didn't really know much about them. Some people call them like the shadow army or the shadow military, the hidden military. But one thing, I'm sorry, I didn't actually talk about this. I just skipped through because I was so worried about time. There is one slide there, the bottom right. For those of you who read Japanese, this is actually a defense expo, which took place in the mid-1960s at Yokohama Dreamland, which was Yokohama Dreamland was a fun, fair amusement park, a little bit like a small Disney World type thing, which existed until about 20 years ago, less than 20 years ago. It closed down. It's actually quite close to where I live. And I found out about this by complete accident. This was a defense expo that was held for 2.5 months. Public, open, children in, with missiles and tanks and helicopters and special forces coming down ropes. This was like something that you would imagine happening in the United States or maybe the UK. This is not something you associate with Japan. This is the effort that the forces were making to engage with Japanese society, but this would not be featured in mainstream media at all. The SDF were almost completely absent from mainstream media, except where there was a plane crash, an accident, ships colliding, or disaster relief operation. And it's the disaster relief operation where the SDF got positive publicity, except negative. So perception of SDF during the Cold War was not high, and many people were ideologically opposed to them. But when you get, strangely, to the end of the Cold War, where their role seems less obviously useful, then the perception of the SDF rose and their public appraisal rose. And it is with their overseas dispatch operations doing peacekeeping and other work that their perception rose. Oh, they're not bad people. They help people. Oh, they're servants of peace. Perception goes up. But where you get the greatest increase of positive appraisal of the SDF in the Japanese society is through their disaster relief operations. And this also actually influences perceptions of US forces in Japan. So what happened in 2011 with the tsunami? The SDF were making such huge efforts. At one time, over 100,000 personnel, which is the total personnel was less than 240,000, and over 100,000 were deployed at any one time. And some were rotated in and out. So practically everyone did something in the area. And the efforts they were making were just astonishing. You know, they were living next to local people, suffering as they were suffering. And that had a major impact. So the positive association with the SDF went up to about 92, 93, 94%. Very, very high. US forces Japan, it also went, the perception of the US generally, but US forces Japan, perception went very, very high. And it may have dropped down a little since then, but it hasn't dropped down remarkably. But what is interesting is the gap. You get 90+% positive appreciation for the SDF by Japanese public. Then in the same survey done by the Cabinet Office, you ask, how many of you would consider serving in the JSDF? And the answer from the 1960s through to today is about 5%. That's the gap. Appreciate what they do, but don't want to do it yourself. There are many jobs which are like that, but the SDF is the one where you see a very strong gap appearing. With the war in Ukraine, there hasn't been a change in perception of the JSDF, but there has been a change in perception, I believe, in Japanese society about the acceptance of risk and about issues such as arms exports, about issues about economic sanctions. Most Japanese people regard sanctions as the right thing to do, as sanctioning Russia as the right thing to do. Defense exports, where they are passive, like protective equipment, most people are fine with that. But most Japanese people have got question marks regarding exporting weapons and ammunition. So that hasn't happened yet. And again, many people in Japan link the issues of Ukraine with Taiwan, which are not actually linked. And we shouldn't fall into that trap of simplistically linking them, but many people do. And they do worry about a potential attack on Taiwan, even though many China specialists I know believe that this is not likely.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, there doesn't seem to be an online question, so if anybody would like to ask one question from the audience, or I could ask myself, unless you have a question. Okay, so Garren, final question from me again. I know that you're a historian, so I'm a historian too. We look back, we try to explain what happened. But if we do, just for argument's sake, if we look forward, and you did mention some of the big challenges, not only JSDF, but Japan itself will be facing primarily, the population problem with the all the other ensuing issues, the lowering number of people who pay tax, workforce, etc. Obviously, people who need help, who need care. So you also mentioned 2049. So if we look into slightly longer term picture, and with the problems that are already quite evident, you mentioned the fact that there's a massive gap between those who like the JSDF and those who are ready to join. So recruitment is already a problem.
Yeah.
So how do you see, let's say, use 2049, 2050 kind of mid-century point, obviously to quite far ahead, maybe 25, 27 years until then. But what will JSDF look like around that time?
Okay.
How will it cope with all these massive structural changes, big challenges that probably it won't have any control over? All the challenges that Japan overall might face in the future, security challenges, strategic challenges, economic, demographic, social, probably too big a question, but maybe just a glimpse into the future.
Okay,
as you see it.
I can engage with some of these things. Well, one of the questions that people often ask me is that will Japan open up and have mass immigration to somehow offset the demographic problem? But unfortunately, that was an option in the 90s when the demographic issue was clear. Japan chose not to do that, but essentially Japan has missed the bus because many other countries now are looking at themselves and thinking, hang on, we are facing depopulation. The reason that the UK hasn't got depopulation is because of immigration. The same is true of many European countries. So European countries like Italy, Spain, Germany, UK are facing an aging of the native populations and a lowering of the birth rate of those who are born in the UK or Germany or Italy, Spain. So the same sort of problem, but we have a much greater sense of immigration or porous borders, shall we say. But other countries are now facing these same issues. Korea and China are facing the same sorts of issues. Korea is in a very, very tricky position. Its birth rate is lower than Japan now. So what I see for Japan is essentially Japan, which will increase its immigration, but not by enough to make a great difference to the population. I see Japan as a country that will try to manage its decline And it might seem like an odd example to choose, but I think the example of a country managing its decline you could choose is a strange one as a historian, Belgium. Belgium was a leading industrial country in 1830. It wasn't a massive great power, but it was a leading industrial country with a very strong economy. And Belgium's population didn't particularly drop, but it didn't expand in the same way that France and Germany and Britain's did. So essentially what you had was the industrial growth was there, but it wasn't a growth of scale. So Belgium continued to be a rich, affluent, law-abiding, peaceful country until it was invaded. But it didn't decline in the sense of wither away. It was just overtaken by others. And I think Japan is hoping that not only will Japan be overtaken as it has been by China, it will be overtaken by other countries too, possibly in economic terms. In Asia, India is the next likely one to overtake Japan. But Japan will be able to manage this relative decline at the same time as managing its absolute decline, because its population by 2050, they're estimating it will be probably less than 80 million people. It will be significantly less than it is today, significantly less. If you're looking at the self-defense forces plus other public institutions, Japan is hoping that mechanization, robotics, and AI can replace some of the human tasking roles, but there's a limited degree where that can fit in. When you look specifically at the self-defense forces, I think if you look to 2049, 2050, we're going to see the ground self-defense forces greatly reduced. I don't see any other way around this, because they have to maintain the maritime and the air forces to a degree. Obviously, with automation, mechanization, and AI, they can do more. But I think the ground forces are going to have to be cut, as they already have been in the Cold War period, post-Cold War period, sorry. So I can see the ground self-defense forces going from what they are now, which is about 140,000 regular forces, down to probably about 80,000. The great mystery to me is why Japan doesn't try to develop reserves more, reserve personnel, people who serve in civilian roles like us, and yet also serve on weekends and in training camps as force members who can be mobilized rapidly to bring their skills to be used. Japan has got a great reluctance to develop reserve forces. It's difficult to understand why, because the UK, Australia, the US has relied upon reserve forces for peace operations and others. It's quite cheap, it's good capability, and it allows for rapid deployment in times of emergency, not least for disaster relief. But the first time Japanese self-defense force reserves were mobilized was in 2011 for the tsunami, and the response rate was 18.7%. So that meant that 81.3% of reservists did not report for duty. And the reason for that was very clear. The reserve system wasn't very good. And basically, these other people had essential roles. They couldn't just drop everything and rush there, because they performed essential civilian roles. So that hadn't been planned through, because it was reserves for wartime contingencies, not just for disaster relief. So again, a reserve system isn't just about numbers of bodies, it's about the actual capabilities of the system and how the capabilities of the people can be used within that system. So I see technical advances, I see cuts in numbers of people, but the great unknown is what the strategic picture of Japan's immediate area and the Indo-Pacific broader area will look like. And that is the great unknown. Will China be in decline by then? Will the US still be in Asia? The great question is about Japan engaging with partners in the free and open Indo-Pacific. Will that mean engaging like that with China? And there are people who can envisage both Korea and Japan potentially shifting and asking China for a security guarantee rather than the US, depending upon how credible the US presence in the region is and how credible China appears as a security actor and a dependable ally. I don't see that as particularly likely, but the way the defense has changed in the past 30 years, nothing is out of the question.
Thank you. Unless you have any final questions, I think on that note, we can once again thank our speaker for today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And before we close the online Zoom, I just have one announcement to make, if I may. Sorry, thank you, Garren. So for our final CJS research seminar of this semester, we will have Dr. Sharon Kinsella from Manchester, University of Manchester, who will talk. The title of the talk is "The Reluctance to Use Sexual Orientation Categories in Contemporary Japan, the New Refusers." And the talk will be after the Easter break on the 27th of April at 2 p.m. So we will have further announcements. It will also be a hybrid seminar/webinar. So I hope to see many of you there. And for today's webinar, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for asking questions. And once again, thank you, Garren, for the wonderful talk. And it was a great pleasure to have you here. So thank you, and please continue to join our talks. And I hope to see you in the future, both in person if you are in Norwich or nearby, but also online. And thank you very much once again. Thank you.